Greetings happy coders, welcome to another video, and as you can see we are back with Usborne Introduction to Machine Code for Beginners, and we're going to be learning a little bit more about Z80 today. I want to give a big thank you to all of you who liked my previous episode. I got quite a lot of feedback. It's proven very popular and I'm really happy with the response, certainly enough to encourage me to continue with this little project, and I hope that you'll enjoy working along with me. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're not actually going to be looking too much at the Usborne book today. Instead, what I thought would be useful would be to give you a little bit of background about computers, mathematics, and counting, let's say numbers, in such a way that you can have a little bit more knowledge about how these things work and a few fundamental principles of mathematics that are not too difficult to understand and that will be incredibly useful when it comes to coding later down the line and understanding how binary works. So we'll have a little bit of history and we'll have a little bit of basic maths, and at the end we'll look at how that applies to binary. And as I said, I think it's going to prove quite useful and hopefully will help to pique your interest, let's say, in the ideas, because when you understand and enjoy something, it obviously makes it a lot easier for you to learn. So, as we mentioned in the previous video, everything the computer does is related to numbers. And every number ultimately goes back to simple pulses of electricity. So the best way for humans to understand that is to give them a value. And since they can either be on or off, the values we give them are 1 and 0. So that's what we covered in the previous video alongside a few other little pieces, and please go back and watch it if you haven't. So for the average person like you or I, we're used to working in decimal. Working in binary can be quite daunting and confusing. It's one of the reasons why many people prefer high-level languages, because they're more human readable. But when using old computers like the Spectrum, it's much more efficient to code in machine-readable format. And that's why it's so useful, important to understand how binary works, because then we're going to work and think like the computer does, if you like. And that does seem a little bit intimidating, and that often is the kind of mental block that people have when it comes to learning machine code. They find that prospect quite daunting and difficult to get their head around. So what I thought I would do today is just to give you a few examples to show you ways that you perhaps you haven't realized, but you already use a lot of these principles in day-to-day life, and certainly things that you might have learned in school are going to help you to understand the way that these numbers work and not to be too afraid of them. So let's take a look at that. Let's begin. Although most of us probably imagine that decimal is the only way that we're really used to, we do actually have non-decimal systems of counting that we use in our daily lives. And the first and most obvious example of this would be this. How many fingers am I holding up? We're counting, but we're not using numerals. Counting on our fingers is really where humanity's relationship with maths begins. And from there, we moved on to carving notches into bones, for example. And this is effectively what we call a tally system. Another name for it would be a unary system. Now, what is a unary system, you say? Well, as you may have guessed, a unary system is a system that only uses one symbol for counting. So if you put counting your fingers, or if you put notches on your bedpost, for example, or you're keeping score in table football with the little slidey beads that you can use to count the score on either side, that's a unary system. Every symbol means the same thing. They all count as one. And all you do to determine the number is literally you just add all of those ones together. So as well as being a unary system, it's what we call an additive system. An additive system is a system in which you simply add up everything that you see and then you get the total at the end. And with the unary system, there is only one symbol and they all represent 1. So it's a case of 1 plus 1 plus 1, just like that. And as I said, there are plenty of examples in real life that you would be familiar with. So the first thing we want to understand then is the principle of the additive system. However, as the ancient Sumerians found, once your civilization moves beyond subsistence living, once you start getting into settlements and trade, and once there is more to counting, say the cycles of the moon or how many animals you've captured and so on, once you start needing to trade with other people, then counting becomes something that needs to be a little more sophisticated. We start to use more than one symbol to represent numbers. So the Sumerians, in fact, had up to 60 different numerals to represent their numbers. But we're not really going to go too much into the history of mathematics today. But suffice to say that we stepped away from the unary system, one numeral for counting, and into using a system where we had more than one numeral to represent different numbers. One of the systems that I'm sure that you will be familiar with would of course be the Roman system. So we'll jump forward in time from ancient Sumeria into the Roman system. The Romans inherited this system from the Greeks, and in turn they took some of that knowledge from the Egyptians, who in turn also took some from the Sumerians. But if you want, you can read about all of this there is a website. It's called storyofmathematics.com. If you'd really like to know more, they can cover this topic far more thoroughly than I possibly could. So if it's interesting to you, please go check that out. Do some research yourself. I personally think that this kind of thing is absolutely fascinating. And for me personally, as Carl Sagan once said, you have to know the past to understand the present. So for me personally, one of the great joys of coding comes from understanding basic principles that have been built up over millennia by brilliant minds across multiple great cultures and civilizations, from North Africa to South America, China, India, Europe, all over the world. We are standing on the shoulders of these giants. And when we're coding, we're using the simple methods and principles that have been used for thousands of years. And for me personally, that's a great source of inspiration, if you like. So as I said, if you're interested in that yourself, then go and check out the website. There is, of course, tons and tons of information on YouTube as well. But let's get back to the Romans. So I'm sure most of us know the Roman numeral system. It is also a tally system. It's also what we call an additive system. You basically add what you see together and get the total. So it uses a tally system 1, 2, 3. That's almost the same as the unary system. And then it uses the symbol V to represent 5 and the symbol X to represent 10. Now, of course, as I'm sure you're about to tell me, just a minute, what about the number 4, IV? And that's absolutely correct, because in this case, they're actually using a subtractive method, because IV means 1 subtracted from 5. But nevertheless, the main principle, the main additive principle that we use still applies here. And this counting system actually is still in use today. Of course, we see it on clock faces. We see it for dates and times. But when it comes to more complex mathematics, this kind of system is extremely cumbersome. And because it was enforced by the church in sort of 400 or 500 years ago, it actually meant that mathematics in Europe was probably held back because of this system. Now, in other parts of the world, places such as China, also the Mayan civilization in Central America, in India, they began using methods that were simpler and easier to work with. And in order to do this, they moved beyond the additive method into what is known as a positional system. So this is the next thing that we need to understand, positional systems. What is a positional system? Put simply, this system uses the position of each numeral to determine its value in the total. And it's the Indian system that ultimately led to the modern mathematics that we use today. And it's the basis for the method used in today's computers, both vintage and modern. So understanding the positional system and how it works is the first step to understanding binary numbers and coding and how to work with them. Let's look at the Roman additive system first of all. As you can see here, I've written out quite a large number in Roman numerals. And you can see how the additive system works. We start with the M, which represents 1,000, and then we add 100, another 100, a 10, 5, a 1, and a 1, and that brings our total to 1,217. What you'll notice is that the letter C here and the letter C in this position both contain the same value. That is to say, it doesn't matter whether the C is in the second position or the third position here, because it's always going to represent 100. If I wanted to add 1,000, I just add another M onto here, just like that. So the principle here is, it doesn't matter what position. They put them in the order of size, but the position itself, the letter itself, does not represent a different number here as to what it represents over here. Now let's take a look at our decimal system and see the difference there. If you take a look at the number 1,217, you can immediately notice, of course, that we're using the number 1 twice in two different positions. In this position, it represents a 10, and in this position, it represents 1,000. So, in this case, the value of the number that we can see here changes depending on the position. And so we are using a multiplication system, because this effectively means 7 times 1. This means 1 times 10, 2 times 100, 1 times 1,000. You then add all those together. So it is still an additive system, but it's also a positional system. So you add those together, and that gives you your total. So obviously with a positional system, it's important that everyone can understand what position each number is in. And in the early period, at least, there was no number 0. It hadn't actually been invented. It sounds strange to think of that, but at the time, people had a little bit of trouble understanding the idea, how can you represent nothing? And the Chinese solved this problem by simply leaving a space within a series of boxes, the early Chinese method. But the Indians began to use a simple dot, which later developed into a full 0. And the 0, of course, is a very special number in mathematics. We're going to look at it in a little more detail. But one of its main functions at that time was to act as a kind of place or position holder to ensure that the numbers were all in the correct places so that it would be easy to understand and count. So let's take a closer look at the numbers themselves in terms of what each position represents. Starting from the right, obviously we have the ones. Then we have tens, 100s, 1,000s, and so on. And what you can probably figure out is that each one of these is an exponent of 10. That is to say, in the first column here on the right, we're not multiplying by 10 at all. In the second one, across, as we're moving from right to left, we multiply by 10. In the next column along, we multiply 10 times 10, and then 10 times 10 times 10. So each place represents a different level, a different exponent of 10. So if we count the exponents, we can see that this one is 10 to the power 0, this is 10 to the 1, this is 10 to the 2, or 10 squared, and this is 10 to the 3. So we can actually number the places according to this exponent. So 0, 1, 2, 3, like that. For example, if we look at 10 to the power of 2, the number 10 is our base, right? It's called the base number, and that's why it's called base 10. And the exponent here, in this case, in this particular place, is a 2. So the base is always 10 in decimal, and the exponent goes from 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on across. So once we have that basic concept, we can move over and take a look at how that would work in a different base. And when we say a different base, of course, we mean we're going to move over. Instead of using 10, we're going to use a base of 2, and that is, of course, binary. Let's go over now, take a look at a binary number. Here you can see an example, and use everything that we've learned to understand the value of this number, which is only 4 digits. So let's say it's a 4-bit number in this case. Here we've got base 2 to the power 0, which is a 1. Here 2 to the 1, which is going to be 2. So this number here, this number 1 here, does not represent a 1, it represents a 2. And this number, 2 to the power 2, is 4. So that means there are no 4s. This one represents an 8. So we have an 8 plus a 2 plus a 1. So that tells us that this number in binary is 11. Jumping back to our Usborne book here on page 28, if you have the PDF, you can see a description of the binary system. And hopefully everything that we've gone through today is going to help you to understand exactly how it works. As it says, it works in the same way as hexadecimal and decimal, except that there are only 2 digits, 0 and 1. So that's why we're working in base 2. So you have to use several digits, and the value of each digit depends on its position in the number. So this essentially is what we've been talking about for the last sort of 10 or 15 minutes. And if you take a look at this, you can see we have 8 bits, which is the size of the bus. The bus is basically the way that the numbers are transferred and moved around the computer. So we have 8 bits. It means it can carry a number with 8 bits within it. And as you can see, we've got the numbers down here. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. Those are our exponents. And that's 2 to the power 0, 1, and so on, as we mentioned. So it's, I hope, fairly clear that the maximum number, of course, would be if everything was switched to a 1. And as it explains here, that maximum is 255. So an 8-bit number can be anything from 0 to 255. And as it explains here, in a binary number, each digit has twice the value of the digit on its right. That's the exponent, as we mentioned. And the first digit shows how many 1s there are in the number, the second the number of 2s, then 4s and 8s as shown. So to convert a binary number into decimal, you simply have to understand that principle. So here you've got a couple of examples. This can be a little homework for you if you like. Just down here, there's a couple of example numbers. First of all, here, as it says, this one 46, this one 135. You can add those up yourself. And here there are a few more examples. So why don't you go ahead and work out what numbers they are, and we'll finish up by saying that in order to really understand coding within Z80, it's very important to understand binary, because the way that you manipulate these numbers, particularly when you're comparing different numbers or when you're doing something which we call shifting, which is when you move the number across to the right or the left, something we'll look at in another episode. These kind of things the processor can do very quickly. And again, so the type of maths that you choose to do is also a factor when it comes to speed. So choosing to work with mathematics in a way that the processor likes and can do quickly is another key to coding in machine language. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. I will obviously go a little bit further into binary, but hopefully now you've got a better grasp of what it is. There are plenty of things you can read up on. If you're really keen on this, go and read a bit more about history of mathematics, history of binary as well. It's quite interesting. It's the basis of modern computing. So it's all very interesting. These are just a few different ways that you can perhaps fire your imagination. So I hope by looking at the history a little bit, helping you to look at breaking it down, if you like, into a few different simple ideas, the addition, the positional system, and so on. It's given you a better idea of how it works, and I hope that this has brought you perhaps a little bit closer to the machine, if you like, because I'm slowly but surely helping you to convert your analog brain into a digital one, kind of like a Borg in Star Trek, something like that. And by the end, perhaps you'll learn to think exactly like the machines. Resistance is futile. All right. So anyway, with that thought, I will leave you, and perhaps we'll be back in another week or two. So please remember to like and subscribe. And of course, if you can, leave a comment. Be great to know what you think about this episode and whether or not you found it useful. That kind of feedback is great for me on a personal level. I love to read how you guys are getting on and if I'm getting the message across clearly. So do your homework, keep on keeping it old school, and as always, happy coding. Bye-bye. This video would not be possible without the amazing contributions from the people whose names you can see scrolling up the screen right now. If you'd like to be one of them, you can get all my games for free, you can get some coding tips, you can even get to dictate which games I work on in the future, and you might even feature in them. So, if that sounds good to you, then head over to the Patreon page, the link is just coming up now, and in the meantime, happy coding. Bye bye!